Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. How many of you are visiting us for the first time this evening? Oh my goodness, so many of you. Well, you're very welcome here. If you're not familiar with us, the Center for Fiction is the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And tonight's event is a prime example of what we strive to do here, which is to create a home for readers and writers here in Brooklyn. So if you would kindly follow us and sign up for our email newsletters, you won't miss anything amazing that's coming, because there are amazing things coming. A couple of housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A this evening, and when it's time to go to questions, if you're here, if you would raise your hand and somebody will bring a microphone to you. That's so that the people who are watching on the live stream can hear your question as well. And if you're on the live stream, you may type your question in the chat at any time. When the event is over, you can purchase copies of I Meant It Once at the bookstore and make your way back into this room and in this center aisle here to get your book personalized. All the books have been pre-signed, so if that's all you want, you can go. But you are welcome to stay. Our cafe and bar will be serving until 8:30, and drinks are allowed and encouraged. And speaking of drinks, I want to say a huge thank you to Algonquin and UTA for sponsoring the sparkling wine to help celebrate the event this evening. And another big thank you to A Public Space for co-presenting with us tonight. Both the Center for, yes, yay! Support for writers is kind of hard to come by these days, but both the Center for Fiction and A Public Space support writers with fellowships. And we're happy that we have fellows from each organization on the stage tonight. So I'm proud to introduce them both right now. Kate Doyle's short stories have been published in No Tokens, Electric Literature, A Public Space, Split Lip, Wig Leaf, and other publications. Originally from New England, she's a former bookseller, hey, and a 2021 Public Space Writing Fellow. She's lived in New York City, Amsterdam, and Ithaca, New York. Joining her is Cara Blue Adams, the author of the interlinked story collection, You Never Get It Back, awarded the John Simmons Short Fiction Prize, judged by Brandon Taylor, and named a New York Times Editor's Choice. It was shortlisted for the Mary MacArthur Prize and longlisted for the Story Prize. Over 25 of her stories appear in magazines such as Granta, the Kenyon Review, the American Short Fiction, and she is recipient of the Kenyon Review Short Fiction Prize, the Missouri Review Pendon Prize, and the Maringoff Prize in Fiction. Her stories have twice been selected as Pushcart Prize notables. She has been honored with an Emerging Writer Fellowship from the Center for Fiction and fellowships and other support from the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Swanee Writers Conference, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, and the New York State Council on the Arts. She's an associate professor at Temple University. We're going to start tonight with a reading with Kate, and then Cara will join her on stage. So let's give Kate a big hand.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Center for Fiction and Public Space. I call this book, or we have come to call this book, about being a mess in your 20s, which I was. And I lived here in New York for many of those years, and here in Brooklyn, and places like A Public Space and the Center for Fiction meant so much to me, in spite of the surrounding messiness. And of course, big thank you to friends and family who are here tonight, and Grania and Betsy and everyone from UTA and Algonquin. I'm going to read from a story called This Is the Way Things Are Now. It is the story that I think of as the beginning of this book. It's the first story I finished that I sort of had the feeling there could be more. And it's about a character who's very close to my heart, who recurs through several stories in the book. Her name is Helen. It's also about a growing distant friend of hers and her family. And just one thing to know about it is that time kind of moves in pliable ways in this book. So we'll move back and forth between the present and the past. Wait, and I did say something I also wanted to say, which is how happy I am to be here with Cara, whose work means so much to me. It's just wonderful. Okay, so the story is called This Is the Way Things Are Now. 1. Catherine and Helen. In high school, they would sleep over in the same bed on weekends, watch old movies, sleep too late. Catherine would comment on Helen's sleep talking in the mornings, and Helen would cover her ears and say, don't tell me, I don't want to know. 2 years later. Now they're 22, and Catherine has this boyfriend she more or less lives with. So she is saying things like, thank you for coming for the weekend, Helen, and here is your air mattress on the living room floor. 3, Christmas, she is 22. Every year, their parents give Helen and Evan and Grace each a tree ornament meant to commemorate some accomplishment in the past year. What will mine be this time, Helen says. Congratulations, you're having a meltdown. Evan suggests, congratulations, you work in a coffee shop, as a possible alternative. 4, amends. Helen calls Catherine on a morning in December that is strangely warm and sort of raining. She stands with her back to the shut-off fountain in Washington Square Park, looking down at her reflection spread around her in a murky slick of puddle. Catherine is glad to hear from her. Catherine appreciates that she's sorry for being a shitty, selfish friend, sorry for hating Catherine's boyfriend, for indulging how it feels to have a strong opinion. Please also tell Alexander I'm sorry, Helen says. Please tell him I'm sure he's actually a nice person. And though Catherine surely won't, she promises she will. 5, Catherine makes tentative conversation. She says, how is New York? How is living with your parents? I still can't believe they sold your house in Rye. I loved your house. On the other side of the fountain, a child falls in a puddle and lets out a whimper. Helen says, my father didn't want to keep commuting into the city from the suburbs. He said it was not worth his time. 6, Catherine says she and Alexander agree. When they have children, they won't raise them in the suburbs. And Helen really hates the way it feels to compare herself. For example, my best friend Catherine lived much of her childhood in Prague. I, for comparison, grew up in the suburbs of fucking Westchester. As if this is the whole point of Catherine, to stand in contrast. Nevertheless, the fact remains, Helen has no idea where she will raise her children, if she ever has them. She may not even want them. 7, Catherine, standing in contrast. She seems possessed of a striking certainty with regards to her theoretical children, especially for someone who used to say in high school, I mostly just hope I have many, many affairs. 8, all-consuming. Catherine, age 15, twirls the spoon around her coffee mug and says, in at least one of my affairs, I'll throw a glass of water in his face, and that will be it. The end. I'll be gone. Privately, Helen finds this enthralling, but she makes a face to imply that it sounds silly. Catherine looks out the window and says, I'd also like one to happen somewhere on the Mediterranean Sea. 9, for old time's sake. In their hometown in the suburbs north of New York, there are sprinklers set to timers on the athletic fields behind the high school. It is Catherine who suggests they run through them on a night in May when they are 17, and it is Catherine who wants to do it again when they are 21, though these days they are talking less and less. Helen from the passenger seat says, no way, definitely not, because Catherine in the car has just said this thing about wanting to have eventual babies with Alexander, and Helen is not at all interested in acting out some pretense of frolic on a football field. Anyway, then it starts to rain. 10, what Helen's mother says about her. You were always very set in your ways. 11, what Helen's mother says about Evan. Why does it matter we always said he was better at acting than you? Couldn't we let him have that thing to be better at? 12, Evan and Grace and Helen's tree ornaments, respectively. The Eiffel Tower for studying abroad, a squash racket, self-explanatory, and a coffee cup. You're working very hard there, says her father. We want to recognize that. 13, Catherine's bed in high school is worn and beautiful like an old cloth doll, and her sheets have a pattern of fading pink vines. She keeps black and white postcards taped to her wall, and when she shuts off the lamp, the light through the window from next door falls over both Catherine and Helen's long hair on their pillows. In the morning, they eat toast in Catherine's bed. 14, on a napkin during a slow day at caffeine, Helen writes, the tension between the past and the present will ruin you. Then she throws the napkin away because how prosaic. She doesn't know what else to do, so she cleans the espresso machine. 15, on the walk home from caffeine, Helen always cries. This is a main feature of the meltdown is having, along with this bombed out sensation in her chest all the time. I think I'm failing at everything and probably deserve to, she tells her parents one night. You're being far too hard on yourself, says her father. Her mother says, you're smart and you've had a lot of advantages in your life, and we're hopeful you will find your way out of this somehow, which feels like saying you have no reason to be sad. 16, while the Gilmore Girls are fighting on television, Helen says, I've been thinking about my behavior, and I'm sorry I have sometimes been a horrible, aloof sister. It is Grace's first night back from college, and they are watching Netflix with the volume up too high. Grace says, I think you haven't really been horrible per se, but thank you. She says, I really hate to see you this way. Helen turns her face into the cushions of the couch and starts crying again. Grace says, can you move over, please? 17, adjustment disorder. It does sound like something you would have, the whole family agrees. 18, Grace's ex. They are making Christmas cookies when Grace says, I called him yesterday. Helen looks up from frosting a reindeer to ask why. Grace shakes green sprinkles on a wreath and says, while you were crying on the couch that one night, I was thinking about how difficult it is for me to be here for you. And that made me feel like I should thank him for how he helped me when I was going through my thing. Helen says, wait, what thing? Casually, Grace replies, oh, after Mom and Dad sold our house and moved back to the city, I was always walking around campus just crying and crying, just missing our house and the way things used to be. I felt really crazy. 19, what their mother says about that. I always liked him. Grace says, thanks, we know, actually. 20, what Helen says, why didn't you tell me? Grace shrugs and says, I just didn't. 21, what Catherine says on the phone, poor Grace, that's sad. 22, Catherine's bed now. Is it as comfortable as the old one? Helen has no way of knowing. 23, terrible fight on Christmas. You are always paddling against the fucking stream, and it's exhausting for the rest of us. I mean, get over yourself, says Evan, not even looking at Helen. And he throws the wooden spoon into the sink and huffs off to the living room. If this family doesn't stop fighting, says their father, sadly, and doesn't finish the sentence. 24, their mother not having this says, Helen, put that spoon back where it goes, please, now. 25, one thing to be better at. Evan is only going to be home for 12 days of his winter break anyway, after which he is going back to Middlebury to start rehearsals for a play. He has the leading role. Before the terrible fight, he and Helen both agree he should spend the whole time at Caffeine, learning his lines and letting her ply him with espresso drinks. One day, he actually shows up. She makes him a macchiato, then another. 26, meet cute. Catherine drops her commuter pass getting off the metro. Alexander dashes after her up the stairs and down the block and into the stationery store on DuPont Circle, where she is looking for a birthday card. They go out for a glass of wine. He asks for her phone number. What Helen never got that year. 27, what Helen never got that year, a birthday card. But how petulant to hold that particular grudge. 28, birthdays. Catherine's is October 3rd and Helen's is May 14th. When Catherine turns 17, Helen brings cupcakes and they sit on the front steps of school, and around them the air is just slightly too brisk. They drink coffee from the cafeteria, the sun warming the sown steps, the wind making the leaves bristle down the driveway. One day this will all seem very far away, says Catherine, while Helen is trying to light a candle and not succeeding. Helen smirks because how misty and all-knowing Catherine can make herself sound. In the end, they leave a dozen dead matches piled on the steps and go back to class, Helen carrying their leftover cupcakes and Catherine bestowing them on passing classmates in the halls, the ones she likes. Actually, I just like that one's earrings, she confides as they're going into English class. I don't even know her at all. 29, Evan's play. 12th night, he replies, I don't know why I didn't ask you earlier, Helen says, feeling sheepish. They are drinking beer on Christmas Eve with most of the lights off after their parents have gone upstairs. Across the room, Grace has fallen asleep, hair streaming down over the side of her face and the edge of the couch, nearly touching the floor. Evan says, and what about you? I mean, are you enjoying your life here? 30, Catherine's text. Feeling spontaneous. A and I are going to come down to NYC next week for New Year's. Let's meet up. 31, contrition. And Helen really is sorry for the way she's been about Alexander, but the fact remains she doesn't like him, and once she reads the text, she realizes the problem hasn't gone away. She isn't going to be mean about it, isn't going to be vocal, but it doesn't change the fact that she doesn't want to see him, not at all. And this is maybe the way it will always be. 32, Evan says, opening another beer, Helen, what could possibly be in that text message that is making you cry? I'm going to stop there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight to help celebrate Kate's really incredible, really outstanding debut collection. And Kate, what a reading.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to talk about this book. I was rereading some of these stories earlier this week, and I have so many passages marked. I actually wanted to start by asking you a more general question. I know that you have recently relocated to Amsterdam, and I know this from social media and also because a friend of mine, a novelist, Linda Roy Fang, emailed me when she saw we were doing this event to say, I think I'm subletting your friend's apartment.
Yes.
And she went on to say that she was enthralled by your bookshelf, and she felt like she was raiding a fashionable friend's closet.
Oh, that's so nice.
So would you tell us a little bit about Amsterdam, what took you there, and also maybe what's on that bookshelf?
Well, half credit to that bookshelf, too. Andy Sanchez. I moved to Amsterdam with my partner for his job, and it's been really wonderful. You and I were just talking about this upstairs, but to be kind of, I think as a writer, to be immersed in something where everything is very new, and even the grocery store and like the toothpaste brands and are like new and fascinating and sort of a doorway into another life that you've entered is very profound and lovely experience. Yeah.
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 And what are you reading?
Oh, in my bookshelf.
Linda discovering.
To be honest, you're usually one of my go-to answers for what's like on my special shelf of beloved books. There's a book called Days of Distraction by Alexandra Chang. Her short story collection is coming out this summer. I fell in love with that book because it's set in Ithaca, and also because it does really interesting things with the kind of tension between what is the narrator and what is the author and what is that gray area between. And so that book came out in like March 2020. So I always like to give it a shout out because it's had a slow arrival. And what else did there's a book called How Fiction Works by James Wood.
Ooh, love that
I
book.
really love. Yes, that's one of my, I think it was very annoying in grad school because on everyone's workshop letter, I was like, did you read this book? I read that in 2013, right before I went into a writing program when I was applying to MFA programs. I read that, and then I read his review of Department of Speculation by Jenny Awful.
Oh, yes.
In combination, those two books, just like, it's kind of the first time I understood that James Wood book, the way he talks about point of view was revelatory to me. And it's not, I don't think it's like explicitly considered a craft book, but I found it very helpful for point of view. And Jenny Awful, Department of Speculation, I think of as like the book that started me writing that story that I just read. I studied nonfiction when I was an undergraduate. I was in like a lyric essay writing kind of program. And so we did a lot with juxtaposition of paragraphs and how like meaning accumulates and momentum accumulates versus sort of a linear plot. But I sort of didn't know you could do that with fiction. And I had been feeling really stuck and unsure that I had it in me to keep writing. And that book kind of just, it showed me that you could kind of take apart and rearrange and mess with time and kind of like use the paragraphs to show the mind at work, consciousness at work, memory at work, the way the present and the past live together. So that's another.
Those are all touchstone writers and books for me too. And that's really fascinating to hear. I think one of the things I love most about this book, isn't just what's on the page, but what's not on the page. You do such a beautiful job of carving away everything that doesn't need to be there. Before becoming a professor, I was an editor for a number of years, and so now sometimes when I read books, I just want to take out my blue pencil and just but there is not a single word, not a single mark of punctuation that I had that impulse with.
Thank you.
This leads into, another sort of more general question before we talk about some of the specific stories in the book. I'd just love to hear a little bit about the process of becoming a writer and writing this book. So you did an MFA and you were a fellow at a public space, rather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Sometimes I think the answer is that I was, at various points in my 20s, I tried to have whatever we would call a real job. Never worked out. Writing was always, I was telling the story the other day for the first time in a while, but I just think there was a moment where I was like, well, I'm going to apply to grad school because I feel very adrift, and I just so I studied writing when I was an undergrad. I felt a little hemmed in by writing personal essay. I kind of wanted the freedom to just mess with it a little more. And so I was like, well, I'll apply to fiction programs and that will give my life some structure. So I don't know that at that time I had such a clear vision. In fact, when I arrived, I was like, oh God, everyone here knows they want to be a writer more than me. And then at the second semester, I was like, oh, we're all terrified. None of us know if we can do this. And I think something about writing short stories that's really wonderful is there was not a moment where I sat down and was like, I'm writing a book. As I was bringing, deadlines are great for me. I would have a deadline and I would panic, and then I would write a story for the deadline, and that happened a few times, and I ended up with some stories, and at some point I started to realize what they had in common that might be, if I kept going, I could have other stories around that theme. And at the time I thought that was time and memory, and what I just said about kind of rendering through fragments the way that the past and present color each other. But I was writing in my 20s, and I do kind of write close to my life, and so when I got to the end of my 20s and I finished a book, people started to say, I think this is a book about being kind of adrift in your 20s. So I think it is. I didn't know that at the time.
I think that really encapsulates my experience of reading the book. I was first thinking about that play between the past and the present, memory, and then slowly it dawned on me, oh, these are all young women in their 20s who are grappling with how to move forward.
Yeah.
I was curious about that, about what that state, what in that state interests you, why that called to you as a writer, that moment where you're looking back, you're sort of wishing that things hadn't changed, but at the same time you know that they needed to, you need to move forward, but you're not sure how exactly, that liminal space.
I think usually most stories I think came out of some feeling of something that felt very intense and unresolved, but I was like, I sort of need to write something that deals with this feeling, and I think those feelings often come of a moment like that where something is kind of gone and you're on the brink of something else, but maybe you don't know what that is. And in your 20s, it's such a desperate feeling time. Your feelings are so intense. You're kind of moving out of, I think for many of us, life has been quite structured up until that point, and then you don't have those structures anymore. And the fear of failure is so huge that tiniest things. I wanted to caveat what I just said about my attempts to get other jobs in my 20s while I was writing, but little failures like not getting an interview or something in those years, they feel huge. And there's something about, I think, the intensity of the feelings of those years that was very interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And also, I think I didn't realize this when I was beginning, but over time I realized that there's something about the way we, as a culture and historically in literature, don't take young women's stories very seriously. And I think a lot of these stories are about young women who have a feeling of this story from a long time ago still bothers me, and I can't figure out if it's I'm silly for still being upset about it, or if it really contains something that I need to understand. Or I think it can, for someone that's I think it contains something I really need to understand, but I'm afraid to look at it. But I think I was interested in the way in those years, it's there can be a way that people talk to you as if your real life hasn't started yet. And that can make your concerns in those years feel like it can be hard to take yourself seriously almost. So I was interested in that period for that reason as well.
Yeah, one thing that was apparent, I think, to everyone as you read is that you address that with a real sort of seriousness. You take your characters very seriously and render them with this sort of photorealist precision. I just totally believed in every single one of those people. But also with this beautifully light touch, with a real sense of humor. I love just hearing all of you get the pleasure of laughing, as I myself had been laughing revisiting these stories. And I marked a passage, actually. I marked a passage that you already read, the one about the Christmas ornament. Which I love so much. And then there's a later moment actually involving those same characters. And I love that you return to those characters, to Helen and to Evan and Grace. But later on in the book, Helen is feeling stuck and she's decided to get a tarot reading from, I believe, a tarot reader in Bushwick. And she's told her family this and they're teasing her about it. And then later she's saying goodnight to her brother, and we get this. This is from a story called Like a Cloud Lighter Than Air. They're saying goodnight on the steps of the inn when he remembers about her tarot reading. She says, "I'll tell you in the morning." "No, Helen," he says gravely. "If you've had interventions from the universe, I need to know about them now." She says, "Shut up, good night, I'll see you at breakfast. Set your alarm, I don't want to wait around like last time." And I just love the way you captured sibling relationships. Helen, Evan, and Grace are so fun to spend time with. And more generally, the humor. Just the humor is such a pleasure here. Would you talk a little bit maybe about both of those things, writing those sibling relationships, and then also just how you do it? How are you so funny?
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you. I'm going to start with the humor. I think, so in the first story in the book, for example, there's a story where this young woman is like gifted a basket of heart-shaped scones as a breakup gift. And I think in that story, for example, like I didn't even understand it as funny at first. I was just trying to let this character, like kind of like I was just talking about, be like, man, this thing still bugs me. I'm just going to like be as honest as I want to be in my own mind about like everything that felt wrong about that and frustrating. And then when I did it at a reading, and everyone laughed a lot. It's like, oh, like there's just some, I think, so the humor just goes hand in hand with trying to let them be as honest as possible. Mm-hmm. But I think in the case of the siblings, the humor comes from the way the siblings can be. I think sibling relationships. Well, here's what I'll say. So the siblings kind of came into that story I just read by accident. I sat down to like write a story about these two friends, and there was this kind of moment where I was just like, okay, like I'm kind of a page in, and I should fill in her world a little more. Like, what else is going on in her life? I'm going to give her a couple siblings, and I thought they would just be kind of like background or side characters, and they just very quickly, as the kind of people they were like, made themselves very important. And it was really, I don't know, it was such a moment of like early on, it's one of the first stories I wrote. It was like such a moment of like when you sort of realize that the process is so magical in a certain way and can just kind of give you, or your subconscious does something that you didn't know you needed. But of course, like the friendship is so much about absence. It's so much about her not being there. And the siblings are always there. And she's, Helen's always thinking about something else. But, there was something that's so fun. And I think the reason that I felt like I wanted to keep writing stories about them, and I think this is the reason they're also very funny, is that they, like siblings, will kind of say anything to each other, and there's just no filter there. And every time that Helen is like, this is what I think about life or my life or how to be in the world, the other two are so ready to be like, I don't agree. I do things differently than that. And there's so much tension and fun, and I just had a lot of fun with it. It was always fun to write about them, I think, yeah.
Yeah, another one of my favorite writers and theorists on craft is Charles Baxter, who writes about this idea of counterpointed characterization. And he says, sure, sometimes we need conflict in fiction, but we also need counterpoint. We just need people to show up who are different from each other, and then to see what that reveals, what happens. And he says a family is a really great frame. It forces people to spend time together who might not otherwise have found each other.
Yeah.
I love Grace, the sister, is an athlete. She loves squash. She's great at that. And of course, the brother is an actor. And they're all really different from each other,
yes.
But in ways that illuminate the others. Mm-hmm. I thought a little bit about the Glass family as I read.
Oh, thank you.
And I was curious about your decision to revisit those characters at different moments in the collection.
I think I just, because they're fun to write about, and because they will always contradict each other, like it just felt like there was so much energy in them always. I never like finished a story about them and felt like okay, I'm sort of done I'm done exploring them. So I just always had an impulse to pick them back up. And there was a period when I was just writing a lot of little paragraphs about them, from all over their life, and not really trying to put them in a story. And then, in a case of a deadline being motivated, I was doing a reading. It had to be a certain number of pages, so I kind of took my favorites, and that was the beginning of the story called Cinnamon Baseball Coyote. And
which is the name of their dog.
Which is the name of their dog, because they couldn't agree on the name when they were children, so they each got to choose one. They smushed all the names together that they all liked. Yes. And Like a Cloud Lighter Than Air was not about Helen originally. I wrote a little bit of that story about someone going to a tarot reader, and the friend Rory, and who kind of has this, in a different way than Grace, has like kind of a blunt way of talking about things, or she just kind of lets things roll off her, and she kind of shows Helen a different way of being. And at some point I realized, like, oh, this could, I don't know, I just hadn't quite figured it out, and I still had this feeling I wanted to go back to Helen, and then I just kind of realized this fit. And I didn't have an ending at that point. It was probably half the story at that point. And making it Helen and bringing the siblings in gave it this whole different energy. Yeah.
I also want to circle back to that scone story, because I feel like we should give it just a little bit more airtime.
Okay.
That's in a non-Helen story, but that sense of humor is still very much there. And in this story, the young man breaks up with the narrator by telling her he doesn't have enough time to see her, actually. And he brings her this batch of heart-shaped scones he spent all afternoon baking. And she thinks, there might be better ways to illustrate the fact that one is too busy to see someone. That brings us into the college setting. That's where they're dating. And a number of the stories are set in college. And it made me think, actually, I haven't read that many stories set in college, which is sort of surprising since so many of us, spend time there together. Yeah. And like a family, it's a place where people are brought together to inhabit space who are very different from each other. Yeah. Would you talk just a little bit about college and writing into that space?
Yeah, I think at the beginning it wasn't very conscious. I was in my mid-20s. College wasn't that long ago. And but what has remained really interesting about it is, what I think there's something about the campus life experience that, like, it's so, like, taken for granted, or something, that, like, you'll go to this, like, up till 17 you'll absolutely live where you've always lived, and then you must leave. and then, I mean, I'm speaking in brushstrokes here, but and then you'll be there, and you'll be there for 4 years, and then you also must leave. And for anyone who struggles with just, like, nostalgia and feeling belonging somewhere, it's, like, kind of an impossible assignment. And there's also something about, like, the lack of anonymity on a campus where everybody knows everybody. And in that story, like, they all know each other's names, and they're all, they're always running into each other all the time and can't avoid each other. And again, like, I just think I look back in those years and it was so normal. And then when I moved to New York, I was like, oh, it's, like, so nice to not be constantly running into someone I know, to have that experience of walking down the street and just being with your own thoughts and just being with yourself. And so I think that's part of it too. But yeah, like you say, like, it brings people together who, but she also says in that story that she finds something very beautiful about the fact that this person, who eventually annoys her very much, she for a while thought it was very beautiful that like fate kind of sent them off to this campus. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like people exit one family and find sort of this new family, in college, and then some of your narrators then circle back to their original family in their 20s,
yes,
as they kind of regroup and figure out how to move forward. Mm-hmm. So I like that kind of dialectic in the book. Another thing that I really admired was the figurative language. You just have so many really striking descriptions of the physical world. There's one I marked in which we get this just incredible image that I find so haunting. Shannon said not to worry. She was emptying the last of the wine into our glasses when she said, "Noah will be fine, and there will be other guys, so many, all your life." There was something sinister in the sentiment. It reminded me of walking in D.C. at dusk on the National Mall, the reflecting pool a long, dark tongue. And I got a shiver when I read that line. You mentioned writing lyric essays for a while. I'm curious about how you think about figurative language. Do you read poetry? It feels very poetic to me, your writing.
I think last night, and I did this sort of soft launch event at Buffalo Street Books in Ithaca, where I used to work, and we were talking about my little bit of a background in theater when I was a student and how that has played into writing. And someone asked a question that kind of made me realize something about it I hadn't before, which is, I think, so I spent a lot of years, I was really interested in directing plays, and so I was in college, and you sit in a room, and you sort of work with just a couple people on stage, and you're messing with, like, if they stand farther apart or closer together, or one of them sitting, one of them standing, or if this one delivers it in a slightly different way, or there's a pause, like what changes. And I think like maybe that on some level got me really interested in just being as precise as possible, because in a play, like the dialogue kind of has to stand on its own, has to speak for so much more. There's no paragraph around it explaining. But I think being able to, maybe it made me like spare about like brush, that if you can sort of just hit an image that gives the feeling that you want it to feel like, then you don't have to explain. I'm not sure how well I'm getting at what I mean, but that an image can carry the emotional feeling of the moment, even if the character is like not even themselves. In that case, that story is so much about somebody who like doesn't want to look at the thing that's upsetting her, but like can't stop thinking about it. It keeps coming back to her, but she's kind of unwilling to like state precisely what is upsetting to her. But then I think the things that she notices, and that one that one took a long time to sort of figure out how to land the ending in that mood. So I think that line came quite late in the process, actually. Yeah.
That's so fascinating about your theater background. I feel like fiction writers are always trying to write screenplays, and then people who actually write screenplays are crossing out all the words. So it makes total sense that would really help you sort of think, yes, I just need the one perfect image. Just let that do the work and move on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that story so much that passage comes from. That's about a young woman who makes friends with a young man named John. And she thinks that they can just be friends, and he assures her that that's possible. But it quickly becomes clear, and perhaps clear to the reader before to the narrator, that his emotions are too strong for that to be possible and for this relationship to be healthy. And then she starts to date someone named Noah, I believe, and then that tension sort of rises to the surface. And there's this kind of quiet menace that I really admired. You have such emotional range in this book, I think. And I just felt this tension and this dread all the way through that story. But it never becomes sort of melodramatic or obvious. It feels complex and nuanced. Just curious about, where that story came from.
It came out of a writing prompt originally. And the writing prompt kind of, I'll explain this briefly. It got us to a point where I was doing it with a group, and there was sort of like trying to imitate a style of storytelling where someone keeps saying, I don't know why I'm talking about this. So I got really interested in that, and so I wrote like a one-page version of it for that prompt, and then I wanted to stay with it because of that kind of, I just was interested in the way she was like circling around something. But that one has like, it took so many years of kind of picking it up and putting it back down and being like, why doesn't it quite work? And at a certain point I realized like part of it is that she never gets resolution, but a lot of what we think craft-wise has to happen in stories is like something has to change, there must be a transformation, and that's like the occasion for the telling. And I think a lot of these stories, but this one is very much about someone who's telling the story because there's no resolution, and maybe she's not going to get resolution. She's unwilling to kind of like name what was upsetting to her because she thinks maybe it's silly, maybe I'm feeling overdramatic, maybe I'm being overdramatic. I can't quite put my finger on like what the transgression was that I felt, but something felt off. But it's so often I think it's like young women in this book will like have a feeling and be like, I don't know if like it matters. I don't know if the feeling matters. I think like she's all these years later, she's still like, I don't know if the feeling I have had about it then and still have all these years like matters or is telling me something important. So I wanted it to read like a short story very clearly, but not do what a short story is supposed to do in terms of resolving at the end or giving clarity. but it was like kind of getting that right. It was like complicated to figure out like, well, how does it end then? Because it kind of doesn't end. So how does the story on the page end? Yeah.
Ooh, I felt like you found a really sly, sophisticated way actually to create resolution. But it's not through something that he does, it's through something that she does. And that for me was really powerful. The idea that the story is really about her understanding what that relationship was and her making a kind of decision.
Because she goes away.
Yeah, exactly, and changes her number. Yeah.
But in a way, it sort of happens to her. Like she says, like my phone number had to change. Like it's like if she did it on purpose, she's not quite
totally
all these years later
conscious.
even able to say like that's why. That's why.
True.
She's like, oh, it was nice that I went away and my phone number was different. Yeah.
In the story, she applies to study abroad in France, and she keeps saying, like, I wish I was telling you about that. That was like a really wonderful time in my life. But instead, it's this other thing that keeps calling me back, which I thought was so true to life and so wonderful. And some part of me was like, I hope someday you write the study abroad in France. But that story really was one of my favorites in the collection. And I mean, so many favorites.
Thank you.
But I love she breaks one of her wrists in this story. And in this wonderful moment of transgression, the young man asks if he can sign her cast, and she says no. And then when she's not looking, he reaches over and signs it. And I felt so violated. But I thought it's such an unexpected and weird way to accomplish that. It feels utterly real. And then later she breaks her other wrist.
Yes.
Which again feels like something that's hard to put in a story because unless you're really skilled, it wouldn't be believable. But it's exactly the kind of thing that would happen in real life. And I totally believed it in this story. And she's avoiding going to see her French TA because she doesn't want them to realize she's broken another wrist. So she waits till one cast comes off, and then she thinks maybe she won't notice that. But then the first thing the TA says, oh, you broke your other wrist. Which also just felt so wonderful and funny and true to life. I was hoping you could talk just a little bit about the process of putting together a collection, because it's such a unique process. How did you decide what to put in, what not to put in, how to order things? How did it come together as a book?
I think I guess I started to sort of say this earlier, but I feel like I didn't quite get to this part of it. When you're starting to write stories, you don't necessarily have to be like, this is my novel, I'm beginning on page 1 of my novel. You're just like writing stories and seeing. And so the pressure is kind of off in a way. It's just like an experiment. And you can also submit those pieces. So I was sending stories out, and then they'd be in a journal, and I got to have an experience with an editor. And so every one of those made the stories better, and also was like a little, like just a little dollop of like, okay, like maybe keep going. And so I think over time I gathered up the stories, and then there was a version that kind of didn't have the stories that go a little more surreal. I kind of thought, oh, like these can't. I had a few stories that were kind of surreal, and I thought, well, these won't be in this book because they don't fit or something. And then in the process of working with Betsy, my editor, we started talking about possible additions, and we looked at those stories, and I'm very glad that those ended up being in there. I think they bring us sort of into the imagination even more than some of the others. And I reordered it many times, just constantly, just and every time I'd be like, I think I got it, and someone would be like, yeah, I think you got it, and then someone else would be like, no. It's sort of I don't know, it's just because it can be just rearranged and rearranged and rearranged. It's like, how will I ever know? Like, this is the answer, yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit like a kaleidoscope. You shake it and you think, oh, that looks nice, that's interesting. And then you shake it again and you think, oh, that has some other virtues.
Yeah. But I think it has to, I mean, keys for it, I would print it out and hang the beginnings and endings up on the wall and stuff like that. And I think it had a lot to do with like, well, what's creating variety, but also how does, like, if this one comes after this one, how does it complicate what just came before, or how does it underscore what just came before? If a sentence, like there's I'm going to forget the line now, but if a sentence appears in this story and then it comes back at the end, like what does the fact that it was in this other story tell us about the mood of this one later, or the interpersonal dynamic here later? Working with those kind of the littler things as a way to. And I went to your panel at AWP about linked story collections, and right. I feel like I was like right at the point where I was like really having to get down to like, okay, I think the stories kind of are good, but I have to get the linking right. And so you're like thinking about that was very formative for me. Yes, so important.
Oh, that makes me so happy. Well, I think it's time to open it up to questions.
Okay.
Yes, what would people like to ask Kate?
Someone told me at my event last night that if no one asks me a question, then I get to ask you questions. So, quick.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hi.
So in this story you read, you managed time in a really original way, and you also mentioned James Wood. So I'm wondering, like, what have you learned about the management of time? Obviously, in this story, you used the list. What have you learned, and what can you tell us?
Ooh, what have I learned about time? It's huge. I love it though. I mean, James Wood and the Jenny Offel book that I read kind of on the recommendation of his review at the time when I was first getting serious about writing, those were very formative in terms of feeling free to tell the story like not chronologically, and look at the way a story lives in the mind that might be different from like telling it in sequential order. But I think this book is about, in part, just about how weird it is to be a human living with time, and how weird it is to have memories and to be in this like whole other part of your life and have this other thing from a very long time ago color the way you understand what's happening now, or vice versa. Something that happens to you makes you think differently about the past, and it's something we all experience. So I don't think we necessarily like think all the time about what's just weird about it, but I guess, the over time working with that more and more because gave me permission in the book to just try to look at time in a way that was less linear and more elliptical, circular, coming in waves, things like that. Yeah.
What else? Oh, here's a question. Terrific.
Hi, we overlapped at Salt and Stalls.
Yes, we did. Hi.
I want to know about your revision process, like with short stories. How do you know when to stop? Was it when you got an acceptance and worked with an editor? Like, how often did you return to ones that you thought were finished? I'm very curious about that.
I wish I had a clear answer to this. I've always been jealous of people who are like, well, I'm on draft 4 now. And I just like pick them up and put them down a lot over a very long time, which doesn't necessarily make for a very instructive answer to your question. But I feel like the shape of the story has roughly always stayed the same from, however, some of them I wrote pretty quickly, some of them took a longer time, but like kind of the shape of the beginning to the end, like there weren't huge changes within that. So a lot of the editing was like finessing little moments, like in the story we were just talking about. It's like it didn't necessarily feel ominous at first. So it's like, how do you sort of going in and being like, where can I put that? Where can I ratchet that up a little more? So yeah, just living with them for a long time. Yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering what you're thinking about for your next book. What's the topic?
So I'm writing a novel. There's a strong expectation on short story writers to also write novels. And it took me a while to figure out what I needed, like what I as a writer like needed to do with a novel. That would give me something different from the short story form. So I am looking at characters who are, I feel like this was my book about being in your 20s. I'm looking at being in your 30s and what those questions are, but it's about the character Helen, again, when she's older. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so excited.
And that's all I'm going to say about that. Thank you.
You talk so much about, being in liminal spaces and having your, the structure of your family home and then the structures of college. And I'm curious about the structures that you have in your life to keep you writing. And, I think that's everyone has different ways of doing that, but I'm also always searching for structure.
Yeah.
Well, I am very deadline motivated, so it's been like, I think leaving grad school was hard because it's like, oh, this isn't like built into my life anymore. I did some generative writing classes at a public space in the kind of middle years of this book that were very important to like keeping going and learning some tools other than a deadline school. And that had a lot to do with, I don't know, I love writing prompts. Not everyone does, but I love working with like chance and randomness. And I kind of think for the same reasons I was saying earlier about like the process can be kind of magical and the thing can be given to you that is like just what you need. And I do believe in that. So yeah, a lot of writing prompts. And as you know, forming a writing group for a while and making each other, giving each other a different kind of writing group, less like school, less like we honor these deadlines, we're rigid about them, and more like what can we kind of create together that will allow us all to do what we each individually are wanting to do as artists. Yeah. Good question.
So your book does such a beautiful job of capturing that like very intense, transformative period of your 20s. I think another thing that can really, and like putting readers back in what it's like to be in that phase in your life. I think another thing that can do that really effectively is music. And so I'm curious, if your book had a playlist, what would you put on it?
Well, next Friday, July 28th, that playlist will be on the internet. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name now. Large Hearted Boy. It's a website about books and music. So I don't consider myself very cool about music. So it's quite a challenge for me. But yes, what was on that side? So yes, what I contributed to the playlist for sure was Belle and Sebastian, a song called Dress Up in You that is about a friendship that is fading away. I'm feeling a lot of anger and longing about that. Show tunes. And then there's a lot of music on there that I now love that I have come to love because I have a partner who's cooler about music than I am.
Hi. I was also going to ask you about like daily writing process. I've been lucky enough to be working alongside you at 2 residencies, and I've always been inspired by your sort of like daily process and practice in terms of prompts and constraint, but also like non-writing things that you feel like you do to help your writing. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Non-writing things. Yeah, well, I'll speak about one, which is when I moved to Amsterdam to find a quick creative community, I joined an improv program, improv comedy, and that's something that I had been very interested kind of like when I was a very sort of starting out writer and thought like, will I write fiction? Will I write scripts? I like theater. Like, what do I want to do here? And improv as a path to TV writing had been very interesting to me at that time. And I think somehow in the back of my mind from those years, I knew there was an improv theater in Amsterdam. And it's been really fun. I feel like it's the same muscle, like to try something out and then just make yourself run with it and don't stop yourself and don't be like, oh, is this really what I want to write? Just to like begin and go has been wonderful. And so yes, that's been great, but also to get to do it collaboratively because the part of me that loves theater does miss the sort of like everybody in the room together feeling. So that's very fun. Yeah, it's been helpful.
We have time for one more question.
Who wants the coveted spot?
Does this mean I get to ask you a question? Oh, hi, Maggie.
Do you have a favorite story from the collection?
This is not a very interesting answer. No. I think I have a particular affection for the story I just read, and I felt like I wanted to read it tonight because it was the beginning, and I wrote it when I was living in New York and feeling a lot of feelings, and that's what that story is about. And I have a lot of affection for that family, and but they're in all three. They're in many stories, so No, I think what's fun, I don't know if you feel this way about collections, but there's something so wonderful about the way they unfold differently. And I feel like I learned this through writing one. I don't think I appreciated it as much when I was just starting out and reading stories, but it's different than a plot unfolding. It's like ideas unfolding. It's like essayistic in a way. And if you put this next to this and what happens and what's the reader experience of kind of moving from this to this to this and seeing these different things juxtaposed and these ideas complicated or amplified or echoed. And so I think because of that, it's very hard to choose just one because I think they all live together. Yeah.
That's a great place to end, I think. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to make you sit here and take the applause in. Just take it in, take it in. Thank you both so much. And I know you're all just dying to get your hands on those books. So just go on out those back doors and grab one and then come back in here to get in line to have your book personalized and say hi to Kate. And Kate, as a former bookseller, would tell you that signed books make great gifts too. So
Yes.
And thank you all so much for coming tonight.